Back in 1996, Mr Howard condemned Paul Keating for governing for the elites. He won the election with the slogan, "For all of us." We now know that was a sham. It wasn't true for Indigenous Australians, for pensioners, for people with disabilities and their carers, or for millions of other Australians who watch as the cost of living rises and their pay packets shrink by comparison. Under Howard's watch, Australia has become more like America, more divided than before. We Greens offer Australians a much better option when they go to the polls on November the 24th. We advocate a more compassionate Australia, a less divided nation and an environmentally secure nation. The Greens have different values and priorities from both the Labor Party and the Coalition. We don't change our principles to suit the latest opinion poll from the big end of town. Where Rudd and Howard have repeatedly voted for above-average pay rises for politicians, the Greens have voted to increase the age pension by $30 a week and to restore free pensioner dental services instead. Where Rudd and Howard backed tens of billions of dollars in tax cuts favouring the already rich, the Greens would raise spending on education to best OECD standards, concentrating the money in schools that need it most. Where Rudd and Howard would build more tollways, we Greens would make public transport cheap, rapid and on time across the nation. Rudd and Howard want to expand uranium mining and exports. The Greens back clean, renewable energy technology for export instead. Before I go into some policy issues in detail, let me list a few where we are ahead of the Howard government's thinking and actions. Today, well, here's one where George Bush is ahead of John Howard, can you believe? Today, the US President will be at Congress to award the Congressional Gold Medal to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, while our Howard and Rudd, after churlish procrastination earlier this year, met him out of public reach. If Ali Alatas warranted an Order of Australia, why not this compassionate Nobel Peace Prize winning Tibetan? The Greens have legislation to ban junk food ads in children's television viewing hours. We would end the scourge of billions of plastic bags in the environment and pursue a national agreement to extend South Australia's highly successful beverage container deposit legislation, which makes stopping litter a paying proposition and creates thousands of jobs. The Greens will end the broad-scale discrimination under national law against Australians on the basis of their sexuality. This includes laws preventing same-sex partners from superannuation entitlements. We will pursue the ideal of one person, one vote, one value, and push for proportional representation in the House of Government, the House of Representatives. We will vote in the Senate against Mr Howard's intention to throw out his own laws prohibiting nuclear power stations in Australia. I will, for a third time, move for a Senate inquiry to lift the lid off the exclusive Brethren sect, which forbids voting and military service, moves money around the world in couriered envelopes, separates families, and ardently supports Mr Howard as the right Prime Minister, a term he's taken up himself. And we will work to ensure the next government has the gumption to take on Japan, including in the international courts, over its bloody harpooning of our humpback and other whales in our Antarctic territorial waters. Apparently in 2007, Australia will be voting to decide who will be Prime Minister next, Kevin Rudd or John Howard. But no matter who holds the keys to the lodge, a strong independent Senate will hold and can hold that government to account. So this election is also very much about the Senate and restoring it to its proper role of House of Review and backstop for the people. There's three possible outcomes in the Senate. One, the coalition will retain a majority, and if it does, but loses the election, there'll be a hostile Costello-directed Senate blocking such things as reform of work choices legislation and moves for climate change action. Secondly, the Greens could hold the balance of power alone, and if that happens, we'll do that responsibly, taking issue by issue. Third, the Greens could share the balance of power with the Democrats. What a great record they have, and how wonderfully they've contributed to the democratic well-being of this country. Or Family First, lone senator, or an independent. But in any balance of power configurations, the Greens will have a major role to play. Remember, if the Greens do achieve the balance of power, our vote will only matter when the major parties disagree. For example, if a Rudd government brings in strong climate change policy and the coalition opposes it, the Greens in the balance of power will determine the result. Alternatively, if Labor and the coalition both support further tax cuts for the rich instead of a pay rise for pensioners, we have to grin and bear it. Our vote would be irrelevant. It's important to note, therefore, that the Greens would be unable to prevent any legislation being passed or to insist that any legislation is passed unless we have the support or are supporting Labor or the coalition. We Greens would use the balance of power responsibly, as I said, just as we've done in the West Australian Upper House since 2001 during the resources boom. We'll restore the Senate's role as the House of Review, beginning with its vital committee system. We will ensure that Australians have their right, robbed of them by the Howard government, to be heard before vital legislation is shoved through the Senate. Either major party willing will have more Senate sitting hours so that legislation and the affairs of this nation can be better considered. The Greens will move legislation to ensure fixed 3-year terms of government to stop Prime Ministers manipulating election dates. You don't need a constitutional change for a fixed 3-year term. We'll restore people's rights to safely enrol at election time. And we will move to stop government advertising unless it is for truly essential public information. And we'll ensure that ads the government puts up there are costed, and that's on the ad with the authorisation so people can see where their money's going. And on a more comprehensive plane, the Greens will work for a Bill of Rights as in most similar countries around the world, something the Americans got 200 years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll pursue a new referendum based on the Greens' 1999 formula, then opposed by the major parties, for a simple yes or no question to Australians. Do you want our nation to be a republic with an Australian as head of state? We welcome the repeated Howard proposal for a referendum recognising first Australians in the Constitution, but that's got to come with consultation with Indigenous Australians. And before I finish talking about the balance of power, I want to make it clear that we'll shred, if we can, work choices and return better protection for working Australians, including the right to be represented by the unions, for better pay and conditions as well coming through collective bargaining. The Australian Greens are now the only party left with a policy of abolishing the full work choices